He signed the foreclosure order at 8:47 in the morning, feeling like the most powerful man in the building. By 8:52, he was staring a name on a file he wasn't supposed to see, and his hands had started shaking so badly he had to set his coffee down before he dropped it. The name on the property deed was his wife's. The name on the trust that actually controlled the bank was also his wife's. And in 5 minutes, he was walking into a boardroom to explain to the real owner of a $90 billion financial empire why he had just tried to seize her own house out from under her. Stay with me, because the woman he thought he married and the woman he actually married were never the same person, and he was about to find out exactly how far that gap went. If this story pulls you in the way it pulled me and while I researched it, do me a favor and hit subscribe, drop a like, and send it to someone who needs a reminder that the people who underestimate you rarely see what's coming. Now let's go back to where it started, because none of this makes sense until you understand who Adalynn Reyes really was before she became Adalynn Voss. Adalynn grew up watching her grandmother run a regional trust company out of a modest office building in Charleston, the kind of place with worn carpet and a receptionist who'd worked there for 30 years. Nobody outside a small circle of bankers and lawyers knew that trust company was the seed of something enormous. Her grandmother had spent 4 decades quietly acquiring smaller banks, absorbing failing credit unions, and reinvesting profits into a private holding structure that never once put the family name on a building. By the time Adalynn was 26, that quiet trust company had grown into Meridian Sovereign Group, a banking and lending institution worth just over $90 billion, spread across commercial lending, mortgage servicing, and private wealth management. And by the terms of her grandmother's will, Adalynn wasn't just an heir. She was the controlling shareholder, sitting behind 3 layers of holding companies and a professional CEO who answered to her directly, but never appeared in public alongside her. She liked it that way. She'd watched cousins and family friends get swallowed by money, chased for it, flattered for it, married for it, and she'd promised herself she would never let anyone get close to her without knowing, first, whether they wanted her or wanted the empire behind her name. So she lived quietly. She used her mother's maiden name, Reyes, for anything social. She drove a car that was nice but unremarkable. She told new people she worked in private banking consulting, which was true in the loosest possible sense, and let them assume whatever modest life that implied. That was how she met Julian Voss. Julian was charming in the specific way that ambitious men often are. Quick with a compliment, quicker with a plan, always 3 sentences ahead of the conversation. He was a real estate developer building a name for himself with a string of boutique residential projects, the kind of developments that got written up in regional business magazines with headlines like the next big name in urban housing. When Adalynn met him at a mutual friend's dinner party, he talked for 20 minutes about zoning law and somehow made it sound romantic. She found that oddly endearing. She didn't correct him when he assumed, from her clothes and her low-key demeanor, that she worked some steady, comfortable job in finance and nothing more. And for the first time in her adult life, she let a relationship develop without leading with who she really was. There was a reason Adalynn guarded this particular secret more tightly than most people guard anything. 2 years before she met Julian, she'd watched a cousin on her father's side, a man named Desmond Reyes, attach himself to a wealthy widow twice his age purely for access to a much smaller family trust, draining nearly half of it before anyone noticed the pattern in his spending. The scandal had stayed contained, handled quietly through lawyers rather than headlines, but it had left Adalynn with a permanent wariness of anyone who got close to her too quickly or who seemed a little too curious about the specifics of her finances. Julian, in the beginning, asked almost no questions about money at all, which she'd mistaken, at the time, for a rare kind of decency. She would later wonder whether it was decency or simply a man too absorbed in his own ambitions to think much about hers. They married 18 months later in a small ceremony neither of their extended families made a big deal out of, which suited Adalynn perfectly. She never lied to Julian, not exactly. She simply never corrected the picture he'd built in his head. She told herself she'd tell him eventually. Once she was certain the marriage was steady, once she trusted that his love for her had nothing to do with money he didn't even know existed. She had no idea how much that decision would cost both of them later. For the first 2 years, everything looked from the outside like an ordinary successful marriage. Julian's development company grew. Adalynn quietly managed her family's holdings from behind the scenes, using a professional alias for board correspondence and letting her CEO, a sharp, loyal woman named Priscilla Odom, handle all public-facing business. Julian never asked too many questions about Adelynn's work, and she never volunteered much. It worked, or at least it seemed to, until Julian's ambition ran into a problem that ambition alone couldn't solve. His company had taken on a massive project, a mixed-use development called Ash Grove Terraces, $40 million in projected value, meant to be the crown jewel of his career. But construction costs had ballooned. A key investor pulled out 6 months in. Julian, desperate to keep the project alive and terrified of the humiliation of a public collapse, went looking for a bridge loan large enough to cover the gap. That search led him, of all places, to Meridian Sovereign Group's commercial lending division. He had no idea, not the faintest suspicion. He sat across from a loan officer in a glass-walled office and negotiated terms with a bank he didn't know his own wife controlled from a floor he'd never been invited to. And here's where the story starts pulling at a thread that would eventually unravel everything. Because to secure a loan of that size, Julian needed collateral beyond his company's already leveraged assets. And the collateral he offered, the one asset that would push his loan application over the approval line, was a property listed in county records simply as the Ashwood Estate, an 11,000-square-foot mansion on 4 acres that Julian believed, in the fog of his own financial panic, he had every right to leverage. There was just one problem. The Ashwood Estate wasn't his. It had been purchased 3 years earlier, before their marriage, through a private trust in Adelynn's name. Not her married name, not even her public alias, but the legal entity tied to her family's holdings. Julian knew it as home. He didn't know it was structured deliberately so that no husband, business partner, or creditor could ever touch it without her direct signature. What he did know was that Adalynn had, at some point, added his name to a secondary authorization document years earlier, so he could handle utility accounts and household paperwork while she traveled for consulting work. Julian, cutting corners under pressure he hadn't told his wife about, used that limited authorization to represent himself to the bank's loan committee as having full ownership authority over the estate. He forged the scope of his own signature. Not her name, just the truth about what he was actually allowed to do. The loan committee, working from incomplete paperwork and trusting the reputation of a rising developer, approved it. Nobody in that room connected the property address to the chairwoman who sat 2 floors above them and never set foot in loan committee meetings. Nobody cross-referenced the trust documents against the shareholder registry, because why would they? It was on paper a routine $40 million bridge loan secured against a residential asset, one of thousands the bank processed that year. And Adalynn, half a world away closing a private wealth deal in Geneva, had absolutely no idea her own husband had just quietly pledged her house to her own bank. For a while, it didn't matter. Julian used the funds to stabilize Ash Grove Terraces, made his first 2 loan payments on time, and told Adalynn nothing because, in his mind, there was nothing to tell. It was just business. His business. The kind of thing he handled without bothering her, the same way she'd never bothered him with the details of her consulting trips. 2 people, both hiding pieces of themselves from each other, both convinced the omission was harmless. Then Ash Grove Terraces hit a permitting delay that stretched from weeks into months. City inspectors flagged a drainage issue that required an entirely new engineering review, and every week of delay meant another week of interest accruing on borrowed money with nothing to show for it. Then a second investor backed out, spooked by rumors of the delay spreading through a development community that talked to itself far more than any of them liked to admit. Then the interest on Julian's bridge loan started compounding faster than his cash flow could absorb it. He began quietly liquidating smaller personal investments to cover shortfalls, telling Adalynn only that the market had been a little rough lately, a phrase vague enough to be technically true and specific enough to end the conversation. By the 9th month, Julian was 3 payments behind, and Meridian Sovereign Group's collections department had flagged the account for internal review. He told himself, during long nights alone in his office long after his crew had gone home, that this was temporary. Every developer hit a rough patch. The difference, he believed, between the ones who survived and the ones who didn't wasn't luck. It was who they knew. And the person he decided he knew well enough to lean on was Grant Holloway, a mid-level executive he'd met at an industry mixer 8 months earlier, back when the loan was still just an idea and Holloway had been the one to walk him through the bridge financing paperwork in the first place. Holloway had a reputation, quiet but well understood in certain circles, for being flexible with borrowers who could offer him something in return. Julian told himself he wasn't doing anything different from what happened at half the negotiating tables in the industry. He was simply being resourceful. This is usually where a story like this would end quietly, with a man negotiating a payment plan and nobody the wiser. But Julian, terrified of what a public default would do to his reputation in an industry built entirely on trust and appearances, made a decision that would detonate everything. Instead of disclosing the missed payments to Adalynn or seeking help from his own family's resources, he did something almost unthinkable. He reached out to a contact he'd cultivated inside Meridian's regional office, a mid-level executive named Grant Holloway who oversaw distressed asset recovery, and proposed an arrangement. If Holloway could quietly restructure the loan and delay formal default notices for 90 days, Julian would bring Holloway in as a private consultant on his next development, a deal worth far more than Holloway's annual salary. It was, in plain terms, an attempt to manipulate the very bank he owed money to, using influence instead of honesty. And Grant Holloway, ambitious in his own right and unaware of who exactly sat atop the ownership chain, agreed. For 3 months, the missed payments were buried in internal memos instead of formal notices. Julian believed he'd bought himself room to breathe. What he didn't know was that Meridian Sovereign Group had recently implemented a new internal audit protocol, one personally requested by Adalynn herself, under her legal alias, after a smaller regional scandal the year before had cost the bank millions in unreported bad loans. The audit wasn't looking for Julian. It wasn't looking for anyone specific, but it was designed to catch exactly the kind of quiet, informal restructuring that Grant Holloway had just engaged in. And that's where the first real crack in this story appeared. Because when the audit team pulled Holloway's file, they found the delayed default notice, the unusual consulting side agreement buried in an email thread, and the property address securing the loan. An address that, when cross-referenced against the trust registry, a step the original loan committee had skipped, matched a private estate held under Holding Entity 7, one of the dozen shell structures beneath Meridian Sovereign's ownership umbrella. The very umbrella Adalynn sat atop. The audit report landed on Priscilla Odom's desk on a Tuesday morning. She read it twice before she picked up the phone and called Adalynn directly, something she almost never did outside of scheduled briefings. "I need you to look at something," Priscilla said, "and I need you to sit down first." Adalynn read the file at her kitchen island, in the very house the report was describing, with her husband asleep upstairs. She read the borrower's name 3 times before it fully landed. Julian Voss. Loan number 4471C. Collateral, the Ashwood estate. Her home. Her trust. Her husband, sitting across from a loan officer at her own bank, pledging the roof over both their heads without ever telling her he was in financial trouble at all. She didn't wake him up. She sat in the dark kitchen until sunrise, working through every version of the last 9 months in her head, replaying every night he'd come home tense and distracted and told her it was just work stress. She thought about every conversation where she'd almost told him the truth about who she really was and stopped herself, worried it would change how he looked at her. Now she understood with a kind of cold clarity that he'd been hiding something too. The only difference was that his secret had put a lien on her house. For the next several weeks, Adalynn did something that would have terrified anyone who understood what she was capable of. She said nothing. She let Julian believe his arrangement with Grant Holloway was working. She let the 90-day window run its course while she quietly pulled every document connected to the loan, The original application, the authorization paperwork Julian had stretched past its actual scope, the internal emails, the side agreement with Holloway. She wasn't building a case out of anger. She was building it because some part of her needed to know exactly how deep this went before she decided what to do about it. What she found next was worse than she expected. Julian's consulting arrangement with Holloway wasn't a one-time favor. Digging through project records, Adelyn's team found that Julian had approached at least one other mid-level employee at a competing lender of the year before with a nearly identical proposal, one that hadn't gone through because that bank's compliance team caught it first. This wasn't a man panicking under pressure for the first time. This was a pattern, a quiet habit of solving financial problems by working the edges of the system rather than facing them honestly, and doing it with the same charm that had once made zoning law sound romantic over dinner. There was one more detail buried in the paperwork that Adalynn almost missed, one that changed the entire shape of what she was looking at. The authorization document Julian had used to justify pledging the Ashwood estate wasn't the original one she remembered signing years earlier. It had been resubmitted to the bank 11 months ago with slightly different language broad enough to plausibly cover asset-level decisions if nobody looked too closely at the original wording it had quietly replaced. Julian hadn't forged her name. He hadn't needed to. He had simply rewritten the scope of what she'd already given him permission to do and mailed the updated version to himself as proof of consent, banking on the fact that she would never think to compare two household documents from different years side by side. It was a small deception, almost invisible next to everything else, and somehow it was the detail that hurt Adalynn the most because it meant he hadn't panicked into one bad decision under pressure. He had planned for the possibility that she might ask questions and built himself an answer in advance. She sat with that discovery for 3 full days before she told Priscilla to move forward with anything, not out of hesitation about what to do, but because some part of her needed to grieve the version of her marriage she believed in before she let herself become the person capable of dismantling the version that had actually existed. 90 days came and went. Grant Holloway, expecting Julian to formalize their consulting arrangement, instead found himself explaining his conduct to an internal ethics board that had been fully briefed by Priscilla Odom, acting on instructions from a chairwoman he had genuinely never once heard mentioned by name in relation to any borrower he'd ever handled. Holloway was terminated within the week, and the file on loan 4471C was reassigned, per standard protocol for accounts involved in an ethics violation, to the Recovery Division for formal default proceedings. Which meant, 3 days later, a foreclosure notice was drafted with Julian Voss's name on it as the delinquent borrower and the Ashwood estate listed as the collateral asset to be seized. And here's the detail that turns this whole story on its head. The Recovery Division didn't route that foreclosure order to some anonymous back office for a rubber stamp. Because the loan amount exceeded the standard threshold, and because the file was flagged from an active ethics investigation, bank policy required executive sign-off before any foreclosure could proceed. Standard procedure sent it up the chain for review. And due to an org chart neither Julian nor Grant Holloway had ever bothered to study closely, executive sign-off for flagged commercial residential collateral above $15 million in this fiscal quarter ran through exactly one office. Julian's office. 6 weeks earlier, in a moment of ambition Adalynn didn't even know about yet, Julian had accepted a short-term advisory contract with Meridian Sovereign Group's commercial real estate division, brought on specifically because of his development expertise to help evaluate distressed residential commercial assets. It was meant to be a resume-building consulting gig, a way to make connections inside a major lender while his own project stayed afloat. He'd been so proud of landing it. He'd told Adalynn it was a networking thing, nothing serious, and she, still deep in her own quiet investigation, hadn't pressed him on the details. Neither of them realized, in that moment, that his temporary advisory role had just placed the final approval for his own foreclosure notice directly on his own desk. He didn't recognize the property address at first. Foreclosure files rarely included personal details, just legal descriptions, parcel numbers, and outstanding balances. He signed off on it the way he'd signed off on a dozen similar files that week, scanning for red flags in the borrower's payment history, not the physical description of a house he lived in every day. It was only afterward, filing the paperwork into the system for processing, that he noticed the trust entity listed as title holder. Holding entity 7. A name he vaguely recalled from a household document Adalynn had once had him initial years ago, back when she'd asked him to help manage utility transfers while she traveled. He pulled the underlying trust file out of professional curiosity more than suspicion. And there, listed as sole beneficial owner and controlling trustee, was a name he knew intimately and had never once connected to any of this. Adalynn Voss, his wife. He sat frozen at his desk for nearly 5 minutes, the foreclosure order still open on his screen, doing the math in his head with a kind of sick, sinking clarity. If Adalynn was the trustee, then Adalynn owned the house. If Adalynn owned the house, then the collateral he'd pledged 9 months ago had never fully been his to offer. And if the trust was tied this directly into Meridian Sovereign Group's ownership structure rather than just holding an account there, that meant something about his wife's life he had never once suspected in 3 years of marriage. He called Priscilla Odom's office, thinking he could get answers from someone in ownership. He didn't yet understand that he was calling the office of the CEO, who answered directly to his own wife. That's the exact moment this story stops being about a foreclosure and starts being about the collision of two people who had each spent years hiding a piece of themselves from the other for reasons that felt reasonable in isolation and became explosive together. Priscilla didn't take his call. Instead, she walked down to Adelyn's private office with the trust file already flagged because she'd been expecting exactly this moment for weeks. "He found it," she said simply. Adalynn had known this day was coming since the moment she'd read that first audit report at her kitchen island. She'd used the weeks since to prepare, not for revenge, but for the conversation she should have had with Julian a long time ago, on terms she could finally control. She called an emergency session of the small executive committee that oversaw major asset decisions, the same committee that would ordinarily rubber stamp a foreclosure like this without a second thought. Julian was summoned to that meeting, believing he was walking in to explain an administrative conflict of interest, the kind of awkward but survivable mix-up that happens when an advisor's personal life intersects with bank business. He had rehearsed an explanation on the drive over. He had absolutely no script prepared for what actually happened when the boardroom doors opened and his wife was already seated at the head of the table, not as a guest, not as a spouse looking for answers, but as the chairwoman the entire room deferred to. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Julian looked at Adalynn the way you look at someone you suddenly realize you never actually knew, searching her face for some sign this was a misunderstanding, a mistake, anything other than what it obviously was. Adalynn looked back at him with an expression that wasn't cruel but wasn't soft either. It was the look of someone who had spent weeks grieving a version of her marriage that had quietly ended before she'd even had the chance to say so out loud. "Sit down, Julian," she said. And for the first time in their marriage, he heard something in her voice he'd never noticed before. Authority that had always been there, simply never aimed at him. He didn't sit right away. He stood at the edge of the table, looking around at faces he half recognized from the advisory floor he'd been working on for the past 6 weeks. None of whom had said a word since he'd walked in. "This is a mistake," he finally managed. "There's clearly been some kind of overlap here, some kind of conflict, and I understand it looks strange, but if you'll just let me explain the loan on its own terms." "There's nothing strange about the loan," Adalynn said, sliding a folder across the table without raising her voice. "The loan is exactly what it looks like. What I'd like you to explain is this." She tapped the second page. "The authorization document you filed with the bank 11 months ago is not the one I signed 3 years ago. The language is different. The scope is different. And you filed it from your own personal email account, not mine, for days before you submitted your loan application." Julian's jaw tightened. He looked at the page for a long moment, long enough that everyone in the room understood he wasn't confused by what he was looking at. He was calculating how much of it he could still talk his way around. "I updated it because the original was vague," he said finally. I thought I was clarifying something we'd already agreed on in practice. You let me handle the house. You let me handle everything with the house for years. I'll let you handle utility transfers and contractor invoices, Adalynn said. I did not let you handle collateralizing a $40 million loan against a property you don't own, using a document you rewrote to make it look like I had. Priscilla Odom cleared her throat gently from her seat near the window. For the record, she said, legal has already reviewed both versions of the authorization. The discrepancy is documented. This isn't a matter of interpretation. Julian finally sat down, the fight draining out of him in stages, the way it does for people who spent months convincing themselves a decision was defensible right up until the moment they have to defend it out loud to someone who already knows every detail. I was trying to save the project, he said quietly. I was trying to save us. If Ash Grove failed, everything we'd built together failed with it. No, Adalynn said, and for the first time her voice softened, though not with forgiveness. If Ash Grove failed, your project failed. I was never going to lose this house, Julian. It was never actually at risk, not for one single day, no matter what you believed about your own authority to put it there. The only thing that failed here was your decision not to tell me you needed help. She laid it out plainly, without theatrics, because she didn't need any. The Ashwood estate belonged to a trust she controlled entirely, established years before their marriage, specifically to prevent situations exactly like this one. The authorization Julian had used to secure his loan covered household administrative matters, not asset-level collateral decisions, a distinction any competent loan officer should have caught and hadn't. The arrangement with Grant Holloway constituted an attempt to improperly influence a lending decision, which was, depending on how the bank's legal team chose to pursue it, either a serious compliance violation or something closer to fraud. And the foreclosure order currently sitting in the system, the one he had personally approved that morning without recognizing his own address, was about to be voided, not out of mercy, but because it never should have been generated in the first place, given the fundamental defect in how the original collateral had been pledged. Julian sat through all of it without speaking, watching 9 months of quietly hidden decisions get laid out one by the one person he had, without realizing it, hidden them all from. When she finished, the question he asked wasn't about the loan or the foreclosure at all. It was quieter than that. How long have you been Meridian? My whole life, Adalynn said. I just never needed you to know that to love you. I thought you felt the same way about me. I didn't realize you were hiding a business you were about to lose on collateral you didn't actually have a right to pledge in a house I already told you, on the day we moved in, was something I protected specifically so no one could ever take it from us. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Somewhere in that silence, Julian understood 2 things at once. First, that his career, at least at Meridian, and likely across an industry built on relationships and reputation, was almost certainly over. Second, and far more painfully, that his marriage had ended the moment he decided solving his own crisis quietly was safer than trusting his wife with the truth of it. The aftermath moved faster than either of them expected. Meridian's legal team formally voided the foreclosure order within the week, citing the collateral defect and the compliance violation tied to Holloway's involvement. Julian's advisory contract was terminated immediately, and the ethics review that had originally caught Holloway's misconduct expanded to include a formal examination of Julian's own loan application. He wasn't criminally charged in the end. The bank's lawyers determined the authorization overreach, while serious enough to void the collateral, didn't meet the threshold for prosecutable fraud, since the underlying signature itself had been his own, not forged in someone else's name. But the reputational damage moved through the development industry the way these things always do, quietly at first, then all at once. 2 projects pulled their partnership offers within a month. Ash Grove Terraces, already stalled by permitting delays, was eventually sold off to a competitor at a steep loss, absorbing what remained of Julian's professional standing along with it. Adalynn didn't orchestrate his downfall. She didn't need to. She simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of decisions he'd made entirely on his own, the same way he'd never once thought to protect her house by simply asking her before he pledged it. The divorce was finalized 8 months later, handled with a quiet efficiency that surprised people who expected a spectacle given who was involved. Adalynn kept the Ashwood estate, obviously, since it had never legally been at risk to begin with once the defect was identified. She stepped, briefly, into a more public role at Meridian's Sovereign Group, no longer quite as invisible as she'd once preferred, partly because the story of the foreclosure order had circulated far enough inside banking and legal circles that total anonymity was no longer realistic, and partly because she'd realized somewhere in those difficult weeks that hiding herself hadn't actually protected her from anything. It had just delayed the reckoning. She thought, often in the months that followed, about the version of herself who had chosen never to tell Julian the truth, convinced that withholding it was a kind of safety. She understood now that safety built on omission is never really safety at all. It's just a countdown clock neither person can see. A little over a year later, Meridian Sovereign Group restructured its lending division entirely, closing the exact loophole that had let an advisor's personal life intersect with an active loan file in the first place, a policy change that industry publications quietly credited to internal reforms following a compliance review, never naming the marriage that had triggered it. Adalynn used part of that year to fund a financial transparency initiative aimed at smaller regional banks, the same kind of institution her grandmother had started with, teaching loan officers to catch exactly the kind of collateral mismatches that had almost cost her everything. It felt, to her, like closing a loop that had opened decades before she was even born. Julian eventually left the development industry altogether, taking a quieter role managing property portfolios for a firm 2 states away, a job with none of the ambition or visibility his old career had once promised him. People who knew him from before said he rarely spoke about what had happened and never mentioned Adelyn's name at all if he could avoid it. Whether that was shame, grief, or simple self-preservation, nobody could say for certain, and Adalynn, for her part, stopped wondering about it after the first year. About 16 months after the divorce was finalized, Adalynn found herself at a small fundraiser for the same financial literacy initiative she'd started funding, one of the few public events she still attended in person rather than through Priscilla. She met a structural engineer named Marcus Ibarra there, a quiet, methodical man who'd spent years inspecting the kind of buildings Julian used to build without ever showing much interest in who owned them. He asked her, early in their conversation, what she actually did for a living, and when she told him the truth, plainly, without softening it or dressing it up, he simply nodded and asked a follow-up question about how a trust structure like hers actually worked, the way he might ask about the load-bearing calculations on a bridge. He wasn't impressed by the number. He was curious about the mechanics, and somehow that was the thing that finally made Adalynn believe someone could know exactly who she was and still just want to understand her, not use her. Their relationship grew slowly, built almost entirely on the kind of transparency her marriage to Julian had never had room for. She told him everything early, not because she owed him her history, but because she'd finally learned what it cost to let someone build an entire relationship on half a picture. What she took from all of it, in the end, wasn't triumph. She never described it that way to the handful of people close enough to hear the full story. What she took from it was a kind of clarity about the cost of hiding, even when the hiding feels harmless, even when it's done out of love instead of malice. Julian had hidden a financial collapse because he was terrified of what honesty would cost him. She had hidden an empire because she was terrified of what honesty would attract. Both of them had built their marriage on a foundation neither had fully trusted the other to stand on. And when the ground finally shifted, it wasn't betrayal in the dramatic sense that broke them. It was the quiet accumulation of 2 people who had never quite let each other see the whole picture, until the picture became impossible to hide. She kept the mansion. She kept the bank. And she kept, more than anything, the lesson that the people who truly deserve your trust are the ones you can hand your whole story to, not just the polished parts, and watch them stay anyway. She hadn't given Julian that chance, not fully, and he hadn't given it to her either. It took almost losing the one thing she protected most carefully to understand that the strongest walls in the world can't save a marriage that was never built on the truth to begin with. Sometimes, late in the evenings, Adalynn would walk the grounds of the Ashwood estate alone, past the gate her grandmother's lawyers had insisted on decades before anyone in the family imagined the empire it would eventually protect. And she'd think about how close she'd come to losing something she'd spent her whole life guarding. Not to a stranger, not to a rival, but to the quiet, ordinary erosion of two people choosing convenience over honesty, one small omission at a time. She never told the story publicly, never let it become the kind of headline the financial press would have devoured for a news cycle. But she carried it with her into every relationship after, a permanent, useful kind of scar tissue. Power, she'd learned, was never really the thing that had put her house at risk. Silence was. And she promised herself she would never again mistake the comfort of not explaining herself for the safety of actually being known. In the end, that was the real inheritance her grandmother had left her, more valuable than any number on a balance sheet. The understanding that nothing you build, no matter how carefully protected, means very much if the people closest to you never actually see the whole of what you're protecting it for.